Welcome. This is our second outreach meeting. It's our Community and Urban Garden Seminar. These meetings are underwritten by a grant from NRCS and done in conjunction with Vivian B. Adams School. Our intent and purpose of our grant is to provide information so that we can begin having community and urban gardens in our area and give you all the information you need to make that happen. During these uncharted and unnavigated times and waters, we find ourselves socially isolated. So this is a great time to gather information, to put your skills to practice in your own backyard, to take the information that's offered to us by these professionals today and prepare yourself to do gardens of your own. Prepare yourself then. Maybe this fall we can come together. We can share our experiences, share our information, share our knowledge, and we can begin to build some of those gardens that maybe right now we're beginning to see are very essential to our food supply in the future.
Hi, I'm James Curtin with the Natural Resource Conservation Service ACES program. The Natural Resource Conservation Service is an agency created through USDA to assist farmers, ranchers, and growers with conservation activity on their land and property. The ACES program was created to assist Natural Resource Conservation Service with delivery of their programs and activities through older workers' career centers. The Natural Resource Conservation Service provides funding and assistance to assist landowners with conservation activities such as fencing, cross fencing, watering trough, livestock, anything to do with livestock. Also, they provide funding to do with small growers on activities such as tunnel houses, garden, community type garden, and they also provide funding. They also help large growers with conservation practice such as cotton, corn, and peanut with the Vivian B. Adams School to discuss and talk about different aspects of what NRCS does. We also provide education, training to also help producers become more familiar and more productive in the way that they carry on their business. And whether you're just getting started up or you've been farming for the last 20 years, we try to assist you and make your operation better.
This is David Kuhn. I'm a regional extension agent with the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Today we're going to talk a little bit about gardening and raised beds and containers. And we're going to cover some of the basics and different sizes and why you do these. What is raised bed gardening? Well, simply is a form of gardening in which the soil is formed in a 3 to 4 foot bed, which can vary in length or shape. The soil is raised above the surrounding soil approximately 6 inches to waist high, sometimes enclosed by a frame, generally made of wood, rock, or concrete blocks. And we're going to enrich that soil with compost. And generally, while we're doing a raised bed, is we're trying to change the soil makeup so that it drains better and it's a better growing media for what we're trying to grow, or simply use the space we have better. Again, it maximizes the available space. It's a convenient option in areas with limited space or areas with poor or rocky soil or sloped terrains. We can take an area that's a drainage problem and create some raised beds and make it an attractive part of our landscape, being able to use it all while preventing that erosion problem. It uses high quality soil mixes with large amounts of organic matter, something lacking in our normal soils, and may increase yields. Some other advantages: soil above ground tends to drain better and warms up faster in the spring, and it allows for a little faster seed germination and transplant growth. Higher soil levels and improved soil quality equal better access and less maintenance, much easier to harvest. We can grow a little bit more in it because we can plant it a little denser and result in a little higher production per square foot. We can also have a little better control over weed seed germination. They can be entered and maintained soon after a rain or irrigation without compacting the soil because we're not walking on it. It doesn't have to be all the way drained. And once it's rained, we can immediately get back out there and work in it because, again, we're just simply reaching into the bed. We're not walking around in the bed. And they can be an attractive addition to your landscape, something to be proud of, and that can be a focal point in your. Some disadvantages: raised beds do tend to dry out a little more quickly in the hot summer months. As we talk dimensions, if you're growing throughout the summer months, I would make my bed a little deeper than if I'm just growing a spring or a fall garden. Frame and soil can be a little expensive and hard labor intensive to create. Limited crop rotation means we're growing some of the same crops in the same areas, so we can increase disease pressure at times. So sanitation is important as we go through our raised beds. Increased plant density also means we're creating a little bit of a smorgasbord sometimes for our insect pressure. It's all in one place and can lead to insects congregating or disease starting faster. And it's not well suited for some of our larger sprawling vegetables like watermelons and sweet potatoes. Dimensions: height, usually a minimum of 8 to 12 inches is needed for proper root development. And again, if we're growing summer vegetables, I would make sure I create my bed a little deeper on the 12-inch side. And if we're just doing fall and spring gardens, the 6 to 8 inches is perfectly fine. Width, 4 feet is about ideal. What we're trying to do is create something we can reach at least halfway across, so we don't have to enter that raised bed to do maintenance, planting, or anything else in our garden. And length can be as long or as short as you want it. 4 feet to 12 feet, anywhere in there works fine. So when we're constructing a raised bed, we simply need a couple of things: a frame to hold the soil and a growing media. Pretty as elaborate as you'd like, or simply without a frame, we're creating a raised area or mounding a bed that we're going to plant in. Pressure treated lumber and planks. We always get questions about safety of pressure treated lumber, and today's pressure treated lumber is perfectly fine to grow vegetables in. The older pressure treated lumber from 30 or 40 years ago had arsenic in it, so we don't want to use that if you have any old pressure treated wood. But today's pressure treated wood, new pressure treated wood, is fine to use for your raised beds. Lots of different options: landscape timbers, rocks, railroad ties, stone, old tires, retaining wall block. Anything that's creative that you want to use is perfectly fine. As we get more elaborate, the cost increases. So pressure treated planks, you can get the frame material for about $25 to $38 depending on the size. You can go all the way up to $300 if you're using block or stone type walls. Growing media, topsoil is best. And we need to make sure we amend that topsoil if we're putting it in there. Try to stay away from using the native soil. That's part of the reason we're putting a bed in most times, is to change the soil makeup to make it better for growing. We're going to add some soil conditioner, some fine pine bark mulch or something to it, some compost or humus. Mushroom compost works wonderfully. Add some peat moss in is fine. Make sure you moisten that peat moss before you incorporate it into the soil. It has a hard time getting wet if you put it in there extremely dry. Composted manures are fine. Be cautious on putting too much in, and also be cautious about what you're bringing in with that composted manures. You know, animals eat seeds and they tend to come out in the waste. So if you're concerned about some of your composted manures, you can simply put some of those in a planting flat, water them, set them out in the sun, and wait a week or two, and see what they germinate. Pre-packed mixes are fine and typically are a neutral pH when you get them, but they are a little more expensive. As we talked about expense, soil media expenses, simple bulk topsoil runs about 75 cents a cubic foot, all the way up to peat moss at $5 a bag. So again, you can be as frugal or as elaborate as you want in your growing material, but we're just trying to create a good, rich growing medium when we install that bed. Total expenses, you can go anywhere from $270 all the way up to $500, just depending on what you choose to add to your bed. Installation, typically we would like to rough up the ground with a shovel or a tiller up under that bed to ensure proper drainage. Don't add plastic or other barriers on the ground to serve as a bottom of the frame. A lot of times we create a bathtub effect that holds too much moisture, and we have some root rot problems if we do that. Place or build the frame on the selected site. Level the frame. Large wood screws are recommended over nails. And another trick, when you buy, if you're using lumber, buy your lumber right before you're going to construct your bed. If you buy that treated lumber a month or two ahead and let it sit out in the sun and it dries, it becomes much harder and much more difficult to get those screws through. So wait till right before you're going to buy that bed. It tends to be a little greener, a little softer, and easier to build. You want to add your new growing media to complete the frame. Mix in additional amendments as needed. Again, adding native soil is usually not recommended because it duplicates some of the problems we're trying to get rid of at that site. Poor soil drainage or nematode or soil diseases, and it kind of defeats the purpose of building a raised bed. When we're adding our soil, we want to add in about a half a cup of dolomitic limestone per cubic foot of growing media, and what we're trying to do is just raise the pH. Generally, most of our soils here in the south are acidic because of the amount of rain we have. So adding a half cup per cubic foot helps us combat that when we're building our beds. And it's much easier to change that soil pH as we're adding the soil instead of from the top putting it on after. So we're going to add it and mix it in good with the soil. Planting techniques, a lot of different options for those raised beds. A typical 4x4 bed with 12-inch spacings, and you can plant 16 potatoes or 16 larger vegetables like squash or tomatoes. Use a little more space, so you as you get a larger vegetable, you reduce the number that can be planted in that bed. And conversely, when you go smaller, you get more in that bed. And it doesn't have to be all the soil. You can change those around so you have 2 tomatoes, a couple of squash, and some smaller vegetables in there also. Container, a little bit about container gardening. Why will we container garden? Some of the same reasons we're going to do raised beds. We may have limited space, limited mobility, don't have access to a good site. A good one is confined invasives. We want to plant something that is very invasive when it gets out in the environment, but we can put it in a container and keep it there. We don't have to constantly weed it or keep it out of our landscape. Biggest disadvantages, water and fertilizer requirements go up a little bit in those smaller containers. Choosing a container, just like our raised beds, be creative. You can use clay pots, plastic pots. You see here a wagon we've converted into a container, some small raised beds that go on our back deck, and a neat little bicycle that the baskets have been changed into planters on. Tips for choosing a container: must have a bottom hole for adequate drainage, must be large enough to hold the minimum amount of media for the mature plants. Make sure the pot fits the size of the mature plant. Type of pot depends on location. We want to avoid black containers here in the south. They tend to heat up extremely hot during the summer months. And remember, porous materials like clay, they wick moisture, so keep that in mind as you're planting those. And again, decide if the container needs to be attractive. What's the purpose? Are we trying to enhance our landscape, or are we simply wanting to grow some patio tomatoes in our container? Coordinate the color with plant materials. A lot of times that helps. Paint to create a different look, cooler surface. Consider weight, especially if you're going to be moving that container in and out of the house. You don't have to fill those containers all the way up with soil, just like our raised beds. We want an 8 to 12 inch root zone, but if it's deeper than that, we can simply line the bottom with styrofoam peanuts, old water bottles, anything to take up that space that's lighter and easier to move around, so we don't have to fill it completely with soil. Potting mixtures. Mixtures must keep containers moist but well drained. Soilless mixtures are best. Typically they're free of disease, insect, and weed seeds. They're light, very porous. You can create your own mix. Peat moss, perlite, vermiculite, sterile potting mixture, compost, and some coarse builder's sand. If you're creating your own mix, it's a good idea to take a sample when you get through that mix and send it to the lab, and they can tell you the pH and whether or not you need to adjust it. Selecting plants, a lot of options here. Annual bedding plants, herbaceous perennials, bulbs, vegetables and fruits, woody plants, water garden plants, all work well in containers and raised beds. Most vegetables are grown in a particular season, making them great for container plants. Select more compact varieties of those plants. If you're using something that sprawls, the smaller varieties do much better. Must plant in a proper size container and keep them watered. So a tomato or a squash needs to go in at least a 5-gallon type container, where a lettuce or a radish can go down to a 1-gallon type container. Some good varieties of tomatoes for hanging baskets listed here: Florida basket, Florida gold basket. Some squash varieties that work good: Dixie, Sundrop, Elite. All work good in our containers. Cucumbers, peppers, snap beans, carrots all work well in containers. And here you see some listed varieties that do well in those smaller spaces. Mixed containers, you can incorporate vegetables with your herbs and your annuals and vines. Just make sure they have the same light and water requirements, so you're not having to water part of the container different or move that container around to get more sun. Consider plant colors, textures, variety, height, and flow, just like a normal container. You know, you want a thriller, a spiller, and a filler. That same thing goes if you're adding vegetables into the mix. One of those can be your filler or your spiller or your thriller, but just consider textures, plant height, and flow when you choose those. Again, always start with healthy, pest-free plants. You want to make sure you inspect them well at the store. If it's ugly at the store, it's going to be ugly at home. If it's got insects or disease at the store, you're bringing those home with you. So select good quality, fresh plants and make sure there's no issues with them. First you want to do is determine how the plants will be arranged in the container. You can cover the drainage hole at the bottom with a small screen or something, just to keep that initial material from falling out as you start filling it. You want to fill the container about 3/4 full. Moisten the potting mix thoroughly, allow it to settle, add a little more media if needed. Then we're going to remove the plants from the container before planting. Make sure we don't have to do any roughing up of the roots if they're root bound or anything like that. If soilless mixes do not contain fertilizer, add a slow release fertilizer mix, and you may need to supplement with a water soluble fertilizer. And again, anytime you're using a fertilizer, especially water soluble, you want to follow the directions on those items. Watering is the most critical and time-consuming part of container garden. Again, they're going to dry out a little faster, so you have to commit that time to go out there every day in the middle of the summer, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a day if it's in a real high heat area. Um, watering time can be reduced by installing some drip irrigation and an automatic timer on those. Very handy, very easy to install. Container plants typically need a little more winter protection. They're going to freeze a little faster, and you can put windscreens or put the container in the ground or move the container to a protected area during those times. If you're using vining plants, they're going to require staking or trellising. Anchor those containers to prevent the wind from blowing them over. And when we reuse our containers, we want to clean those containers with a 10% bleach solution before use, and it just kills pests and removes fertilizer salts from that container. If it's a porous container like a clay pot, we want to soak that in water prior to planting just to make sure it doesn't wick the initial soil moisture out of the soil. Again, if it's a big container, we don't need that full container. For growing media, we can fill the bottom with styrofoam peanuts or any filler type material. We've seen old water bottles used, or anything that basically fills that space and the soil can lay on top of. If we're planting newly propagated plants, take your time as you're moving them from their nice, safe environment of a inside starting to a outside environment. We're going to harden those off a few days or 3 or 4 days before we actually put them in the container and put them out in the wild. You want those containers elevated just a little bit so that drain hole works. You don't want that drain hole up against the concrete where it can get stopped up and not drain.
Do you want to make improvements on your land that are good for your operation and the environment? USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service can help. NRCS provides technical assistance to all producers and financial assistance to qualified applicants who are interested in installing conservation practices on their fields, pastures, or forests. This can include using water wisely, preventing soil erosion, installing cross fences, planting trees, or many other conservation practices.
We work with farmers, ranchers, forest landowners, and tribes. So come by, we'll discuss the goals you have for your property and determine what conservation practices would be a good fit.
We'll help you develop a conservation plan, a roadmap for how conservation can work for you on your land. The conservation plan includes a map of the property and a set of conservation practices that we recommend for it. We'll even help you apply the practices. If you're interested in financial assistance, NRCS may be able to help you there as well. NRCS will take a look at program applications and rank them according to local resource concerns, the amount of conservation benefits the improvements will provide, and the needs of applicants. Before you visit with us, you'll want to have a few things ready: an official tax ID, a property deed or lease agreement, and a farm tract number. Don't worry if you don't have one yet. It's easy to get from USDA's Farm Service Agency. Usually, they're located in the office right next door.
All right, so let's get started. Stop by your local USDA Service Center today.